Hello, everyone. This afternoon, we'll have a presentation from Dalya from Stanford University. Okay, well, Dalya, the floor is yours.
Thank you. Hi, everyone. Good afternoon. I'm very excited and happy to be here, and I hope to be able to interact with many of you during this week. I'm going to stay here until Saturday, so please feel free to come and chat with me. And so this lecture is going to be a sort of continuation of what you heard this morning about machine learning, but we're going to be focused more on unsupervised learning and specifically talking about how to apply these algorithms effectively to astronomical and ISM data. And before we start, just a bit of a background about myself, where I'm coming from and what I'm doing. So I'm coming from Stanford University, where specifically I'm what is called an Astro AI research scientist in a new center that is called the Center for Decoding the Universe. It's a collaboration between Stanford Data Science and the Astronomical Department at Stanford. And we're trying there to find data science and machine learning solutions to different scientific questions within astronomy. But before that, I am an astrophysicist and an astronomer, and I'm an observer. I'm interested in galaxies, in supermassive black holes, in feedback, and I did my postdoc in Carnegie observatories, and I'm a heavy user of the Magellan telescopes. And in fact, tomorrow night and the night after tomorrow, I'm actually observing during the night on Magellan. In my free time, I have the hobbies of a 5-year-old. This is Ori. It means my light. And when I'm not with him, I usually up in the forest or in the mountains running. And please, I'm very happy and want to meet and interact with all of you. So please don't be shy and come and introduce yourself. Yes, so we're observing these different sources, and by observing these sources, we hope to be able to reconstruct the physics that drive the evolution of the sources we observe from these many different observations. This is what essentially we're trying to do. Okay. So another thing that sort of characterizes astronomy is that the sources that we're observing are extremely complex. I'm showing you here 3 different examples, the pillars of creation, the galactic center in radio wavelength, and a galaxy merger observed with JWST. And you can see that these systems are extremely complex, and they often require us to build very complicated models that depend on many properties that we don't really know, the spherical cow type of models. And there are many different models that can, in principle, describe some of the observables that we get from these astronomical sources, and it is often difficult to distinguish which of the models describes the observations better. So in order to sort of rule out some of the models or understand which models are more consistent with the observations, in astronomy, where we have been for a very long time mining our data sets and looking for patterns. What type of patterns are we looking for? So one of the things we like most are universal functions. If something is universal and sort of we see it again and again and again, like the initial mass function, it has a very strong constraint on the physical models that we build for star-forming clouds. Because these star-forming clouds and the physics that we implement inside have to, for example, result in a sort of universal initial mass function. We're also looking for scaling relations and trends in the data. So, for example, different types of correlations between different properties, the luminosity and the rotational velocity of a galaxy, the surface density of molecular gas and the star formation rate, the relation between the black hole mass and the stellar velocity dispersion. So all of these, again, constrain the models that are potentially describing our data, because these models now are required to reproduce the observed scaling relations we see in the universe. Another thing that we're doing is to divide the objects in our sample into classes, trying to find similarities and places where these classes are different one from the other, which may later suggest different formation mechanisms, different physical laws in play. And of course, we're very interested in outliers because these can sort of stretch the limits of the physical theories that we're building. Some of the outliers that have been detected and now are known astronomical sources, you can sort of see them here. And so in the past decade or so, there is this emerging new field that is called data science, which is how we do science with our data using statistical tools and machine learning. But I would sort of suggest that uncovering these types of patterns is actually something that astronomers have been doing for basically a lot of decades. And here in this lecture, we're going to try and see how we can use unsupervised learning to uncover these patterns in the data. And why now is a particularly exciting time to do that. So we all know to see how we can use unsupervised machine learning algorithms to explore our data and lead to new discoveries. And so this morning you heard a lot about machine learning, and you heard about the difference between supervised and unsupervised machine learning. And this time we're going to be focusing specifically on unsupervised learning, which is a family of algorithms that do not require some ground truth label or target to train on. So these algorithms are operating directly on the data, and their output can be, for example, clustering, where we take the objects in our sample and we associate each object in our sample into some cluster. The number of clusters is typically smaller, much smaller than the number of objects in the sample. Another thing we do is dimensionality reduction. We take a high dimensional data set and we embed it into a lower dimensional space, typically 2 dimensions or 3 dimensions, for us to be able to visualize the data. And there are automatic algorithms for outlier detection, identification of rare or anomalous phenomena in the data set. So these are the things that we're going to explore. And it is useful to sort of think before every time before you're learning about a new unsupervised learning algorithm, it's useful to think of this in the context of this equation that I'm writing here, where we have some function that operates on the data and has some hyperparameters that we need to set, and there is some output to it. And it's good to, every time that you're looking at an unsupervised learning algorithm, to try and identify these different components. So this X is our input data set. It can be the raw data, so the spectra, the images, the time series. It can be extracted physical features, so physical properties we measured from the data, molecular gas mass, metallicity, ionization parameter, dust to gas ratio, etc. And it can also be measured relations between objects, so correlations or distances between the objects in our sample. The second component are these hyperparameters. These are parameters that define the output or the mode of operation of the algorithm. In many of the cases, what the algorithm is trying to minimize depends on these hyperparameters, and these are up to us to set. And they have a very strong impact on the output that we're going to get. So it's important to identify them and understand what type of effect they have on our output. In addition to this, F itself includes some internal choices or cost functions. And the internal choices also have a very strong impact on what we can extract from our data. And we will see examples for that before in a couple of slides. And so it's very important to understand what is the cost function. What does this algorithm try to minimize when doing this process? And finally, we have the output. The output can be a density distribution. It can be clusters, so basically a list of all the objects in our sample and an associated index that describes the cluster. It can be an embedding in a low dimensional space, or it can be, for example, a list of outliers. So we'll go through, you're going to see this slide twice. Good practices of how to approach an unsupervised machine learning algorithm you're not familiar with. And I will say now, and I'll say again at the end of the lecture, that it's never the first step to apply this algorithm directly on your data. Applying it directly on the data should be at least like 5th or 10th step. You have to start very simple. You have to simulate very simple data sets in order to understand what the algorithm is doing, what it minimizes, what are the hyperparameters that your setting are doing. But we'll go through that later on. And the tutorials that you're going to have in the hands-on application are also built in this way, essentially, of starting with simulating very simple data sets where things are very clear and gradually increasing the complexity to understand what's going on. So we're going to touch upon a couple of things in this lecture. Sorry. The first and most important thing that we're going to talk are our input data sets and distance measures. After that, we're going to talk about clustering, dimensionality reduction, and outlier detection algorithms. And the thing is, so this lecture is not very long, and learning how the algorithms themselves work, this is something that is available online. You can read about it if you want. I will give you, a general description of some of the algorithms. But what is less available online is how we should be treating our data as scientists before we use it as an input to an unsupervised learning algorithm. So a lot of the discussion that you're going to see now is going to be focused on how we can actually prepare our data and what considerations we have to have before we're applying these algorithms to our data sets. And then we'll talk about the algorithms. After I'll finish the input dataset and distance measures part, I will stop for questions. Let's see, okay. Okay, so what type of input datasets we have? It's important to understand that the algorithm takes as an input a list of objects with n measured properties. These measured properties, I'm going to call them features, regardless of whether these are physical features that you derived from the data or the actual flux measurements or temperatures that you're measuring. And by default, each object is considered as an n-dimensional point, as a point in an n-dimensional Euclidean space. And that's quite important. And most of the algorithms that I'm going to show actually assume that the distance between objects is Euclidean. So you'll see as we move on that the first step in most of the unsupervised learning algorithms is measuring distances between objects. And the default assumption is that this distance is Euclidean. And this has significant implications to what type of information we can extract from our data using these algorithms. Okay, so what type of data we can put into these algorithms? We can use the raw data. So this is the data that was obtained from the telescope. So for example, images in different bands, spectra, time series data. I'm saying minimal processing, but we will talk about it in a while, but we do want it to be calibrated. We do want to clean it and calibrate it like we do in other science applications for this data. And in this particular case, the features that I'm talking about are the actual flux values we measured in different spectral channels or different pixels in the image. So when I'm saying a feature, I mean the flux in every pixel in an image. We can measure physical properties from the data. We can measure masses, we can measure luminosities of lines, we can measure temperatures, we can measure densities, and we can use these physical properties as the features of input. So for example, if my dataset is a dataset of H2 regions, I can define the features to be the ionization parameter, the optical line ratios, the derived metallicity, et cetera, et cetera. And so each object is an H2 region with measured features. I can go even a step further and already define how similarity or distance is defined between these objects. And there are different ways for me to measure these distances or assign these similarities. I will show you a couple of them later on. But I can decide from what point I want to start, where I want to basically put my data, and this will be the data that will serve as an input to the algorithm. Now, even if I don't assign distances between the objects, it's important to understand that both in the raw data and derived features case, the first thing that will happen is distance measurement between the objects. You can't escape that. So this is something that happens whether you control it or not, and we need to understand what consequences it will have. In terms of processing, here is a line sort of showing you an arrow where we're less processing the data and where we're processing the data more and more. And so here, potentially, we don't need to have a lot of knowledge, astrophysical knowledge about our data set, but as we move further along this line, we have to apply more and more astrophysical knowledge in order to bring the input data to this place. And so there are different considerations about whether we're using raw data or derived features, and I'm listing here a couple of them. In terms of data quality, obviously when we're measuring physical features, we typically also clean the data in the process. We identify various errors, we identify places where we have wrong calibrations, for example, and so the data will typically be cleaner when we derive features. In terms of simplicity, if we're starting with a very complex data, so for example, an image of a region or an H1 spectral cube, we're talking about hundreds to thousands of features or the dimensions that describe each object. Whereas if we derive physical features, we're typically using much fewer numbers to describe each object. And it is both more scalable to many of the algorithms that you're going to see, but it also simplifies the learning process. And my typical suggestion to you is that if there is something that you know for a fact that is always true, use it in the data preparation. Don't let the algorithm sort of figure it out for its own. So one example, we know what redshift does to spectral lines. Okay, we could have taken like spectra of H2 regions in different galaxies, for example, not de-redshift them and put them as is in the algorithm, and hopefully the algorithm, if it sees enough data, it will be able to identify a redshift sequence. But the question is why? If you can correct for redshift effects and sort of de-redshift your spectra before you use them in the algorithm, you should do it, because then you will have a bigger opportunity of finding something new, because the algorithm will learn some different pattern in your data that is not the effect of redshift on your observed wavelengths. Another point is interpretability. When we're using physical features that we're deriving, it's easier to interpret the result that we're getting from these unsupervised learning algorithms. Now, you've seen this morning that this new generation of models, like deep neural networks, one of their main strengths is the fact that they can sort of extract relevant features from the data without us predefining them. But compared to supervised learning, in unsupervised learning, we don't have ground truth. And so when we reach the point where we have the clusters or we have the reduced dimensionality visualization and we need to interpret it, the first thing that we will want to do is to color code the result by known physical properties. So in unsupervised learning, I would suggest that it is very difficult for us as scientists to escape understanding our data and the physics in our data. We need to understand how to derive features, what are the important features in what we're doing. And we have to use it in order to interpret what we're seeing and understand whether it makes sense or not. Upper limits and non-detections. In general, machine learning algorithms are not extremely tailored towards fitting noisy and gappy data as we have in astronomy. In particular, unsupervised machine learning algorithms, their default mode of operation does not include any treatment of upper limits and non-detections. But when we measure features, we sometimes can't measure a feature because it's below a certain detection threshold. So in that case, we have an upper limit. And there is no trivial way of incorporating these upper limits into the algorithm unless we're building the distance measure ourselves. Whereas when we use the raw data, we don't have this problem because we have a spectrum, we have an image, there is something to put into the algorithm. So the entire treatment of upper limits and non-detections is not trivial when we're using derived features. And in terms of potential for new discoveries, when we're deriving physical features, naturally we're sort of limiting the context of what we're doing only to the features that we measured. Everything that we haven't measured will not be included in the dimensionality reduction or outlier detection, and so we might miss interesting discoveries of things that we didn't think about measuring features that are connected to. And so one could say that using the raw data may increase the potential of discovering something new because we don't have to impose and sort of limit the problem to something smaller. Okay, what type of considerations we need to have? The first consideration is related to scaling and normalization. As I said, and I will say, like, you will get very tired of that, but I'm going to say it like 100 times this lecture. The first step in every unsupervised learning algorithm is measuring distances between objects. And the distance that we typically measure is the Euclidean distance, which is the summed square differences of the features that we measure. So here is an example of 3 objects in my data for which I measure the stellar mass and the metallicity. So you can see that the scale on which the stellar mass is changing here by 4 orders of magnitude, from 10 to the 6 to 10 to the 10. Whereas the metallicity changes from 0.2 solar metallicity to 2 times solar metallicity. And so if we use these derived features as they are and we put them into the Euclidean distance, we can see that the distance will be completely dominated by the measurement of the mass. It will be completely dominated by this feature and will not be sensitive to the other feature that we have in the data. And so and if we think about, for example, some kind of raw data, if we're using fluxes as a function of wavelengths and we have different photometric points, for example, again, there will be some points that will be an order of magnitude or 2 orders of magnitude higher than other points. And the question is, do we want our distance measure to be so much more sensitive to things that are brighter in flux versus not? So what can we do? We can rescale and normalize the features or the raw data. So for example, for features that are changing over orders of magnitude, we can take the logarithm of the value. We can also normalize using the mean and standard deviation to sort of bring all the features to live in the same range and make them contribute the same to the distance measure. Some of the algorithms that you're going to see are based on variance. Their optimization is based on the variance that we have along a certain feature. And so if we have outliers in the data that have a very, very large or very, very small value, they can actually change the total variance that we're seeing and completely change the output of the algorithm. And so we want to inspect our features and we want to inspect the data, identify outliers, and understand whether these are sources or objects we need to remove because there are different errors, or we need to somehow have a different treat for these, because it could be the case that 1 out of 1,000 objects will completely dominate the dimensionality reduction you're getting if its value is much, much larger than the other objects. Another important thing to think about are correlated features. So especially when we're working with raw data, what you're seeing here are mid-infrared spectra of a major merger system from this paper here. And if we're thinking about features as fluxes measured in different spectral bins here, you can see that a lot of these features are basically tracing the dust continuum. So they will be highly correlated. And because of that, their statistical weight as a whole will be much higher than other features within the data. So we can, and the question is whether we want it or not, whether we want this type of behavior to dominate the output of our algorithms or not. So there are different ways to address this. We can use PCA to sort of transform ourselves to a different coordinate system where this is not such a huge issue. We will talk about PCA in a couple of slides. If we're talking about derived physical features, if we know that there are some correlations between different features, for example, the flux of the H alpha and the intensity of the carbon monoxide line, we can define a feature that is the ratio between the two instead of using these two if we want to not have this correlation in the data. We can also use deep neural network-based dimensionality reduction algorithms. For example, autoencoder. I will show you a brief example about that later on. And as you've seen this morning, these deep neural networks are very good at extracting features from the data, even if things have significant spatial or temporal correlations between different regions in the dataset. Okay. Sorry. Okay, a bit about feature importance. When we're using the raw data, we know that some features will carry less information than others. What you can see here, for example, this is a HI4Pi map of the H1 emission in the Milky Way, where essentially in every point in the galaxy, we have a spectrum of the 21 centimeter emission. And so if we're using the raw data as is, this is just an example. It's not really an H1 spectrum from this survey. I just took it from a different presentation. But essentially, if you're using this as the input to your algorithm and the features are defined as the flux values at every velocity channel, you can see that many velocity channels do not have any relevant information in them. And the information that you care about is here. And so then there is the question of what is the range, what is the fraction of features where you actually have information you care about. Okay, imagine a case where this line is occupies only 10% of all the velocity measurements that you have there. And so in that case, your distance measure and the output of your algorithm may very well be dominated by the noise fluctuations here versus the actual signal that you care about here. So this is something to think about. Similarly, when we're talking about, again, the mid-infrared data from JWST, so in this case, we will have most of the pixels are continuum pixels, and so the statistical weight will be highly towards that these specific feature. But if, for example, we really care about these these ionized emission lines that are occupying a very narrow wavelength range, and we want to be able to have an algorithm that takes them into account properly, we cannot apply an algorithm or a distance measure directly to this data without doing some kind of weighting. So you always, when you look at your data, you sort of need to understand what it is that you find interesting about the data, and to make sure that these things that you find interesting as a scientist are actually things that are traced in the distance measure that you're doing. This would be an example that you're going to have in the tutorial as well. What you're seeing here, I've simulated 3 spectra of, let's say, galaxy. It's not exactly a galaxy, but there are 3 spectra here, A, B, and C. And so you, by eye, if you had to sort of identify which of these spectra looks different from the other 2, how many of you would say A? Spectrum A looks different. How many will say B? according to the Euclidean distance, B is the different one from A and C. And the reason is I did a trick. I made it slightly redder. You can't see it with your eyes because it's really not a huge effect, but there are so many pixels that are stellar continuum pixels that even if I change it by a bit, I completely change the distance that I'm going to measure. And so what we see by eye as an emission line, and we find it important because we don't see it in the other spectra, the Euclidean distance doesn't see. Here is another example with time series data, where now we have the phase information as well. And so if we're measuring Euclidean distances between time series data, for example, without taking into account the phase, we will again find that B is the different light curve, and A is actually quite similar to C. So you will see the code that generated these figures in one of the tutorials, if you will want to do this tutorial. And so it might be beneficial to think about whether you need to transform your data from the original space to some other space that is more useful for the scientific application that you care about. So in time series data, for example, we might consider using going to a frequency domain. In imaging data, we might consider to doing a wavelength transform or a scattering transform. And we might, for spectral information, use representation using eigenvectors, like in things like PCA, which I will show soon. The final thing that I want, again, to emphasize about distance measures, and specifically about the Euclidean distance, is the fact that, okay, yes, okay. When we're measuring Euclidean distances and we're taking the sum of squares of the differences between the different features, this distance doesn't care about the relative order of features, okay? So let's look at this example here. Again, I'm simulating this weird looking spectra here. I have flux as a function of wavelength. Every flux value is a feature. And so you can sort of see what these things look like, and we can obtain the Euclidean distance between them by subtracting flux minus flux to the power of 2 and summing it all up. The surprising or maybe weird thing is that if I take these spectra and I shuffle the wavelengths to result in this weird thing, the distance is the same. And the reason is that we don't have any dependence on what is the relative location of the features one with respect to the other. So all the very rich information about the correlation structure between the different features is lost. And this is, again, something we must think about and remember when we're working with these algorithms. For an unsupervised learning algorithm with a default setting of Euclidean distance, these objects and these objects look the same. Okay, so there are other metrics we can use. So we can, for example, decide that we want to use correlation measurements instead of actually working in flux space. There is also a very nice statistical measure of similarity between probability distribution functions, which you can actually, as astronomers, you don't have to do things strictly as statisticians do them, and you can just apply them to 1D vectors, normalized to be like a probability distribution function, and it turns out it works really well to measuring similarities between things that by eye you would say are similar. Two additional distance metrics that I like very much are called the Earth mover's distance and the energy distance. They are related to each other the same way that the L1 and the L2 norm related to each other. And the really cool thing about them is that the relative order of the features matter. So think about an emission line, for example, a single emission line that you just shift in wavelength. The Euclidean distance will not see any difference, essentially, when you're doing this kind of shift. But distances like the Earth mover distance and the energy distance will actually increase as you move the spectral line to different wavelengths. And this is, in many cases, something that we want. Again, it's a very weird sort of way of measuring distances. Maybe statisticians will not like so much this suggestion, but it actually works very well in practice. Here is a list of popular metrics that you can later examine and see whether some metrics are more appropriate for your data than others. Okay, I'll stop now for a couple of questions. And drink water.
So my question is, if we're trying to understand what the age of star cluster is by looking at its spectrum, which metrics would be the most informative in this case?
So just to make sure I understand the question is if I work with spectral data, if I have spectra, what metric will be most useful to us to examine?
To retrieve age.
To what, sorry?
Retrieve age of star cluster.
To derive the age of the star cluster? From spectra or from photometry?
From spectra.
From spectra.
Like HR for emission, this kind of stuff.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. I'm not sure that I have a good answer specifically for star cluster. We can talk about this later for me to understand better exactly what type of information you have, whether, for example, you're tracing different, like, absorption features and measuring their equivalent width or measuring the DN4000 angstrom or the equivalent width of emission lines. I'm not exactly sure what type of the data set you have in mind. But my typical suggestion would be to actually start with deriving features, not work with the actual raw data, but derive features, use traditional algorithms as I'll show here, and sort of only if you see that these don't work well enough, only then complicate to something else. PCA, which I'll describe here again, I know that it is a very, very old technique, but it's amazing. It works really well, and I would always suggest to start with it. Before you're doing anything else, start with PCA, see what it looks like, and identify where it doesn't do what you want it to do, and only then move on. The cool thing about PCA is that if, for example, you're working with spectra, it sort of builds you a list of eigenspectra that represent the spectra in your sample and make it easier for you to later apply Euclidean distance between the points in this new coordinate system. So that would be another thing I could suggest. I specifically worked with a lot of spectral data during my career, and I found the Earth mover distance and the KL divergence to actually be quite working well for spectra. There is another very weird distance that is based on an unsupervised random forest that we actually found to be really working well for spectra, but this is we can talk later about specifically your application and think about whether there is something in addition to the things I suggested here. But I would say yes, first derived features, maybe then PCA, and only later consider things that are more advanced.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you a lot for your talk. I was wondering, you showed the slide where the multi-wavelength observation was infrared, optical observations with a cross-match of these catalogs. And I don't know why you don't analyze X-rays catalogs. I know it's very hard to cross-match X-rays catalogs with optical or radio, but I think it would be very useful to get the whole information, what we can do with X-rays.
Yes, that's a very good point. I'm assuming you're talking about this. Where is it? This? Yes, so this is here, you're revealing my bias. You can see here at which wavelengths I am working, essentially. And you can also see that somehow like all of time domain astronomy is non-existent in this slide. I had to remove it in order to fit this box in. Definitely. Every information that you have, and it's true that X-ray is becoming more and more like covering larger and larger fraction of objects. I definitely think that every information that you have across the electromagnetic spectrum should go into your analysis if you can do it. If you can cross-match, if you can cross-calibrate, then you should. Mm-hmm. That's a very good question. I'll repeat it so the people that hear on Zoom can hear it as well. So the question was, how can we cross-match? So there is this challenge that the X-ray resolution is much coarser typically than optical and infrared data. And the question is how we can cross-match these different observables in order to apply these types of algorithms. So I would never use machine learning to do something like this. I think that if you can do forward modeling, where you're including the response functions of your instruments and the noise properties of your instruments, and you forward model the entire like field of view in different images, trying to see what type of astrometrical match you have there, you have the best chance of doing the cross matching correctly. That would be my point of view. Okay. If you have more questions, I'm happy to take them later. I want to move on. Let's see. Okay, I have an hour. Okay. So these were some of the data considerations you have to have before you start applying these algorithms. You will have a tutorial in the hands-on application exploring all of these different things that I showed you here. And what we're going to do now, we're going to talk about doing a very general and fast overview on dimensionality reduction algorithms. Unfortunately, I don't have the time to go into a lot of details about each of these algorithms and how it works. I have prepared Jupyter notebooks and more extensive slides for you to go over in your hands-on applications, if you'd like, and examine these different algorithms. But now we're going to sort of not go into too many details about each of them, unfortunately. Thank you. And you're going to see a lot of letters. So here I just spelled out what all of these mean. These are the different dimensionality reduction algorithms I'm going to touch upon. So what is dimensionality reduction? So in dimensionality reduction, we're taking a data set on across high dimensions, either raw data or derived features, and we're trying to embed the objects into a lower dimensional space while retaining some meaningful properties. And this is a very vague statement because meaningful is very different for different people. And this is why there are different algorithms that are doing different things. But here is a sort of an example of what we can think about when we're thinking about meaningful information. So here you can see a data set that is composed of handwritten digits arranged in a 28 by 28 pixel image. So if this is our input data, every object has 28 by 28 features, and we apply dimensionality reduction, where now every object is described only by two numbers. So you have points here, and every point corresponds to an image from our data. By retaining meaningful information, we might, for example, hope that all the digits that are 0 here will be clustered together in this space. All the ones here will be clustered in a different part of the space. So in this particular example, this is what we might call meaningful. But we do need to remember that when we're doing the dimensionality reduction, we're going to lose information. This is not something that we can escape. And the question is what information we keep and what information is being lost and how it relates to the type of science that we want to do. And we're going to describe different types of algorithms that do these kinds of things. And before I'm going to talk about the algorithms, I want to show you traditional dimensionality reduction in astronomy, well before there were any algorithms. And the first and my favorite one is actually the stellar sequence. So here on the right, you can see spectra of stars, optical spectra of stars, and you can sort of see that they're extremely, like for an untrained eye, they look extremely complex. There is a lot of things going on. The continuum changes from being blue to being red. There are absorption lines that appear and disappear. There are all sorts of things that happen, these broad bands that you're seeing here. But astronomers, well before there were even computers, have found that if you plot them on a color versus magnitude diagram, all the stars sort of lay down on a single trend. So essentially, all of this complexity that you're seeing here is part of a one-dimensional sequence that you can later tie to the temperature or the mass of the star, which is amazing in my eyes. And this is dimensionality reduction. This is a very efficient embedding space of 2 dimensions that describes the object in the sample. Now, of course, if you take a deeper look, you can start seeing that there is some information that is encoded here that is not, or more difficult to encode here. I don't know, for example, the metallicity or the chemical abundances, the nitrogen over oxygen, the iron over oxygen, and things like this might not be visible here, but are visible here. So these are the next dimensions. But as a first, like order of magnitude, first dimensionality reduction, I find it completely magical, the fact that this plane even exists. And this also sort of gives you the motivation of why we want to do it. We want to take the complex ALMA and H1 cubes that we have, or the new JWST observations that we have, put it into an algorithm and find the space in which the problem appears in its most simplest form, right? This is our goal, essentially. Another traditional dimensionality reduction in astronomy, specifically in galaxy spectra, we also have these color magnitude diagrams that sort of break up galaxies into red and dead and star-forming galaxies. And we also have these BPT diagrams that are plotting optical line ratios versus optical line ratios. And these, again, sort of break down and tell us a lot about the system with only 2 numbers. So these were obtained well before we had computers, or no, this we already had computers, the previous one, no. But today we can hope and do it with automatic tools. So we want to use dimensionality reduction in order to uncover new trends and correlations in the data. We want to sometimes use it in order to visualize the data and interpret it. We want to look for outliers or interesting objects. This becomes less and less relevant, but I decided to put it anyway. But if we're using traditional supervised machine learning algorithms and not deep neural networks, then these dimensionality reduction techniques can help prepare the data before we use it using supervised machine learning algorithms. And in some cases, we would like to compress our data, even sometimes lossy compression, which requires some sort of dimensionality reduction as well. But the things that I am most excited about are these 3, essentially. Okay, so what type of outputs we get from these dimensionality reduction algorithms? The first type of output, and this is something we get from essentially all algorithms, is a low dimensional embedding of the objects in our sample. Either a 2, 3, or it can be 5 or 6, whatever you want. I mean, depends on the algorithm. But this is sort of the thing that we're getting for each of these different algorithms. For some of the algorithms, we also get another product out, something like a prototype or an eigenvector, which is a sort of representative of a certain place in the parameter space. So, for example, in this particular case, a prototype might be a sort of an object that represents what the objects in this region look like. Eigenvectors are sort of these building block components with which you can reconstruct back your source. I'll show you a couple of examples as we move on. Some of the algorithms give you these types of prototypes or eigenvectors, and these are quite useful when we're trying to interpret the data. Because so when we take a data set and we embed it into 2 dimensions, now imagine that we don't have these labels and don't have colors here, and we want to understand what are the differences between different regions in this map. It's very useful to have these type of representatives or eigenvectors to tell us what this map is driven by. Yes, so exactly that. Okay, and so, sorry. So the first algorithm I want to describe is principal component analysis, which I really can't stress enough how powerful and good it is. And I would always suggest you to start with that before you're doing anything else, just to sort of see what you're getting, what you're seeing in the data. This is a linear transformation that does not depend on hyperparameters that you have to set, that basically changes the coordinate system into a coordinate system that is defined by these principal components, which are axes that capture most of the variance in the data. So you can see here, for example, this is a 2-dimensional data, so we don't really need to reduce its dimensions. But if we plot the principal components in this data, the first one will be pointing this way, describing the largest variance in the data, the direction in which we measure the largest variance in the data. The second component will be orthogonal to the first component and describing the next direction of maximal variance in the data, essentially. And if you remember, I told you that when we have outliers in the data, for some algorithms that are sensitive to variance, this could be an issue. This is one of the algorithms where we care about variance, and you have an example in the tutorials showing what is the effect of outliers of different magnitudes, let's say, on changing these type of components. And so essentially, if, again, this is only like very intuitively, if you want to go into the math, you will see the longer version presentation in the tutorial. But if we have now a bunch of spectra and we want to apply principal component analysis to them, we're getting 2 things back. The first thing that we're getting is a matrix with eigenvectors. These are our building blocks with which we can later reconstruct every object in our sample. These are the vectors that point into the point with the maximum variance in space, but orthogonal one to the other. The second thing that we're getting is what is called eigenvalues that are given here in this diagonal matrix. And each of these eigenvalues describes the variance that is associated with each of these components, essentially. So in this particular case, this first component has this amount of, explains this amount of the total variance in the data. This component has this amount and this component has this amount. And the trick with PCA is that essentially we're trying to cut down and identify the minimum number of principal components or direction in space we want that describe the amount of variance we want in the data. And so in this case, for example, the 4th, 5th, and 6th component explain much less of the variance of the data. And so we can sort of decide to keep only the first 3 components in describing our data. And then every object in the sample is a linear combination of these different eigenvectors. And so I can reconstruct, I can build again every object in the sample using these 3 eigenvectors. And so now, instead of having a spectrum that has, 1,000 or 3,000 values, I can describe each spectrum by 3 numbers, A1, A2, A3. That's it. Of course, I'm losing some information. I cannot escape that. But it's a very efficient way of doing this kind of decomposition under the constraint that this is a linear one. PCA, when you decompose with PCA, it allows for negative values both in the principal components themselves and in the summation. However, in astrophysics, in many cases, we like to think about things as a positive sum of positive contributions. We have emission, we don't have minus emission. We do have absorption, but absorption is not a minus effect, it's a multiplicative effect. So it's a time exponent to the minus tau, okay? And so in some cases, we would actually want to enforce positivity in our eigenvectors and the composition. And one way to do it is using non-negative matrix factorization. There is a very helpful resource that you can reach here. There is also this entire code is provided to you in a Jupyter notebook in one of the tutorials, and you can play around with with these three algorithms and compare them if you want. Okay, moving on to self-organizing maps. So self-organizing maps are another type of dimensionality reduction algorithm. I find it a bit confusing that they call it a neural network, but they call it a neural network, so we'll call it this way as well. And you have a lattice that is distributed in 2 dimensions in the output here. And this type of training is part of what is considered competitive learning, where in every iteration, you take an input object and you sort of find what neuron is closest to it, again, in Euclidean distance or the distance that you define type of way. And then you adjust the weights in this network such that objects that look similar to it go to the same type of neuron. And so when you're doing this process, using all of the objects in your sample iteratively, you get to a point where you have objects that look similar sort of assigned to the same node in this lattice. And if you examine this 2-dimensional representation, you see that the properties of the objects or the representative change smoothly across this map. So this is another example of an algorithm that actually gives you a sort of prototype you can then examine. You put all the objects in, you train it, each object is associated with one of these nodes, and then you can examine the node itself to understand what type of objects it represents. So it's nice to use it for interpretation. Okay. And now quickly about nonlinear dimensionality reduction algorithms, specifically t-SNE and UMAP. These are nonlinear algorithms that basically take data and reduce its dimensions to 2 or 3. And will not go into the details of how they're doing it. I'll try to give you intuition about that. And again, it starts with measuring distances between objects. So we're starting at the high dimensional space. And in this high dimensional space, we have the distances between the objects in the sample. And so what t-SNE and UMAP try to do is to find a representation in the 2-dimensional space or 3-dimensional space where you conserve as much as possible the distance distribution of an object to its neighbors, essentially. So the iterations and the actual optimization function looks a bit different in both of these algorithms. But when you're doing this kind of process, you have to give up something. You have to decide whether you want to sort of focus on small scale structure or focus more on large scale structures. You cannot get both of them. And because of that, these algorithms have hyperparameters that you need to fix. You need to decide which hyperparameters to use. And specifically in t-SNE, you have a hyperparameter that is called the perplexity. In UMAP, you have the hyperparameter that is called the number of neighbors or nearest neighbors. And these affect how much you're sensitive to local structure versus global structure in your data. And you can sort of see an example here. Here, these are my simulated, again, spectra that you can sort of by eye see a sequence, something that is changing continuously about these spectra. And you can use them as is, by the way, with the Euclidean distance, I think, in this example. And you can define different perplexities in t-SNE to reduce the dimension of this thing into this two-dimensional plane. So here, every object represents a spectrum from here. And you can sort of see that when you're taking a very low perplexity value, meaning that you really care about the nearest neighbors to your object in the high dimensional space, what t-SNE ends up doing is breaking down this sample into these tiny clusters, essentially, of things that look similar together. But as you gradually increase the perplexity, you actually start seeing a sequence that comes out. If you increase it too much, then everything sort of falls into one point. And thank you. And perhaps a very important thing when you're using these maps is to be very careful about how you interpret them and their outputs, because we sort of tend to think that when we have this two-dimensional space, things there are Euclidean. If things look closer on this map, they're closer in some way. If things are farther away, they're farther in some way, but this is not the way this dimensionality reduction works. And in fact, above a certain distance measure in this map, distances don't mean anything anymore. I want to show you, let's open it up. I do think it's very illuminating. So in both of these cases, you can sort of pick input data sets and you can change the hyperparameters of UMAP and t-SNE and see what would be the two-dimensional embedding that you're getting. There are a lot of details here about how we need to be careful about misinterpreting the map. That's my favorite example. So you can see here the original 3D data set of a mammoth bones. You can see what it looks like and what it looks like when you apply two-dimensional UMAP projection. And let's now change the number of nearest neighbors. And you can sort of see how it enforces global structures on sort of, it still doesn't look like a mammoth in the end. But I think it's very illuminating to look at these examples and then think what it does to your astronomical spectra when you put them inside these algorithms and what you are able to extract from these maps and what you are not able to extract from these maps. So I encourage you to go into these resources and check them out. Okay, I will just say a word about this. A couple of years ago, we developed an algorithm that is called the sequencer that tries to find a one-dimensional sequence in the data and reorders the data according to the found sequence. Here is an example of simulated spectra. This is a box plot showing all of the spectra, and what the sequencer tries to do, it tries to find a one-dimensional structure in the data using graph theory and the minimum spanning tree, for maybe some of you know. And it basically reorders the data according to a sequence if it finds it. So this is a dimensionality reduction in the sense of only giving you one dimension for data that has a very clear sequence in it. And if you want to play with it, you can actually upload your data and this website will sequence it for you and will output you the result. The final thing that I feel a bit bad about having only one slide about this, but it was basically either have an entire lecture only on that or have only one slide on this. And this is basically everything that is happening nowadays with deep neural networks and transformers and foundation models, all sorts of very interesting things that are happening in the computer science community. And it has some consequences to dimensionality reduction in the most general sense. So have you talked about autoencoders? A bit. Okay, so I'll also talk just a bit. Autoencoders is a special type of architectures where we're starting with our original source and we decrease the number of neurons as we move from layer to layer, essentially, until we get to some minimal layer that we call the latent space. That has the minimum number of neurons within this layer. But the interesting thing is that instead of here sort of adding classification or regression optimization and have a loss function, we actually go into what we call the decoder, where we increase the number of neurons as we go outwards until at the end we're reaching a layer that has a similar shape to our input layer. And so essentially, if we have our original mushroom here, we can think about this network as compressing this mushroom into a small number of features or measurements, and then it has to decode it back to the same mushroom. And the optimization is to trying to get the output mushroom to be as similar as possible to the original mushroom. So this is called self-supervised. There are different techniques under contrastive learning as well, where you're doing this kind of process. And the interesting thing in the context of dimensionality reduction is that here we can sort of consider this region here as our compressed low dimensional embedding of the source. Things that you might hear about in the future, transformers, then we're not talking about latent space, we're talking about embedding space, but there are similar concepts there where there is a sort of low dimensional space that hopefully contains the relevant information that we care about. And there is a very nice review of application of these tools in astrophysics that I encourage you to read. It's a whole field. And I will note that it's an ongoing research to understand how informative is this embedding space, how informative is this latent space, and what it includes about our sources and what it doesn't include. My suggestion to you always, if your goal is to be a researcher in data science or machine learning, by all means, try all the algorithms, try to use the most, new and complicated algorithms. But if your goal is to do science, my suggestion to you is to start as simple as possible with the simplest algorithms that have fewer choices to make, and gradually complicate if you see that you're not getting what you want. Because working with these algorithms can take easily 1 or 2 years to even understand what's going on there and to be able to run them and interpret the results. But yes, please read this paper. It is very interesting. Okay. Let's talk about clustering algorithms. Okay, so when I think about clustering, I'm thinking about one of the basic things we can ask of our data. We have new data coming in and we want to ask, what is there in my data? And sort of the first thing that we can do is sort of divide the objects into different classes and start exploring their similarities and their differences. So again, clusters in astronomy. Before we had this beautiful HR diagram, we actually were dividing stars into unique classes, O, B, A, F, etc., etc. And in many cases, by the way, in astronomy, we actually start with clustering or classes and only then understand that this is part of a continuous sequence, essentially. But in many cases, it is easier to start with clusters, explore the similarities and differences, and then understand what's going on. Another example is the galaxy bimodality. We have galaxies that are red and dead and not forming stars, gas poor, and we have the star forming galaxies that are gas rich. Another example from supernovae, we have different spectral classes of supernovae, type 1a, type 2, and then under type 2 we have a bunch of different subtypes in them. So all of them are sort of handmade clusters that astronomers have built over the years. But today we have different automatic algorithms to do this kind of clustering. And so if we think that, I'm showing you here in a 2-dimensional space, but the goal of clustering algorithms is to define classes and assign a class for every object in the sample. Some of the algorithms also allow for outliers, for things that are not associated with any cluster. Now, obviously, when I plot the data in 2 dimensions, we can see if there are classes or not. Sometimes it is easier, sometimes it is more difficult. But the goal of clustering algorithms is being able to apply it directly on a higher dimensional space. Of course, you always have the option of first applying dimensionality reduction to a two-dimensional space and then sort of apply clustering in this space as well. These things have different advantages and disadvantages, but you have this option if you want. There are many clustering algorithms, and they do different things. They assume different things. And I really love this example. This example, every column here is an application of a specific clustering algorithm on a set of different data sets. So you can see the geometries of the different data sets, and the colors represent the assigned clusters. And you can sort of see what each algorithm does, and you can also see what happens when there are no clusters in the data, what each algorithm will give you as an output. So I think just staring at this diagram is extremely useful, but in addition to that, there is a very nice documentation by scikit-learn that compares these different algorithms, and I encourage you to go and check it out if you're interested in doing clustering. Okay. Let's go briefly over the type of clustering algorithms that we have. So we have what is called centroid-based or partition-based clustering. One of the most common ones in this family is called k-means, where essentially we're trying to divide the data into non-hierarchical clusters that are defined by cluster centers. We typically initialize the location of the cluster center somewhere. It's outside. We typically initialize the center of the cluster location somewhere, and we iterate, we assign objects to this cluster, and we iterate over it until we sort of break the space into these different clusters. In many of these cases, we need to define how many clusters we look for in the data. So this is like a hyperparameter that we need to define. It scales quite well with the number of samples and the number of features that we have. And it is quite sensitive to the initial conditions and to outliers in the data. Again, in the tutorial, you will have application of k-means clustering algorithm with different types of outliers in the data, and you can see what starts happening to the clustering that you're getting. It has a flat geometry, and it usually results in even cluster sizes. So the number of objects assigned to every cluster will be quite comparable one to the other. Then we have a family of algorithms that are hierarchical, where we essentially merge smaller clusters into bigger clusters, or sort of break the entire group into smaller and smaller clusters in an iterative way. And there are different algorithms that that do a sort of hierarchical clustering. It scales quite well with the number of samples and the number of features. And it can give you very non-even cluster sizes. In one of the tutorials, I'm giving you an example of how you can actually use hierarchical clustering to visualize very complex correlation matrices to sort of identify subgroups that are highly correlated or anti-correlated one with respect to the other. So you can explore that later. We have density-based clustering, where essentially the way that we define these clusters are according to high-density regions in the data space. And here are a couple of algorithms that can do that. They scale quite well with the number of samples, but because we're talking about measurements of density, they're not scaling so well with the number of features, the curse of dimensionality this time. We can result in uneven cluster sizes, and we can have non-flat geometries. And what I find to be the most useful thing is that it actually marks outliers. Not every object in the sample has to be associated with one of the clusters, but it does struggle with data that has varying densities. The final type of clustering-based algorithms are distribution-based, where we're assuming that the data is composed of a sort of distribution, and then that, points that belong to the same cluster need to belong to the same sort of probability distribution function. It does need to assume a probability distribution, And because of that, it does not scale so well with the number of samples or features. But the nice thing about that is that we get an assigned probability for every point to belong to every cluster, which can be something quite useful and interesting for us. So it's very difficult to answer the question, which clustering algorithm should I use? I'll go here to to where you have this image. I find this table here with the different algorithms quite informative. It lists to you what type of hyperparameters you have there, how it scales with the number of samples and the number of features, when you would like to use it, and what type of geometry this thing has. So I find it quite useful when I want to do something like doing clustering. Okay. Let's briefly talk about outlier detection. Okay. So what type of outliers we expect to see in our data sets? Unfortunately, the most common type of outlier that we'll see in our dataset are bad objects. These are not very interesting things, but they're there because there are errors in our pipelines that we're measuring, and they're part of our dataset. In addition to that, we might have misclassified objects. So if we're working, for example, with a sample of H2 regions, and we have couple of supernova remnants that somehow sneaked into our datasets. These will be our misclassified objects, and they will be outliers in an H2 region catalog, for example. Outliers can also be tails of distribution, so objects that show an extreme property in luminosity, temperature, duration, and they can also be what we call unknown. So objects that are in our dataset, we do not know we should be looking for them. They are anomalous in some aspect, and they can be very exciting and interesting. And of course, out of all of these different types of outliers, in the context of discovery, that's the one that we're really after. But we have to sift through many of these in order to be able to get to this as well. And perhaps an important point to mention that while on Earth and in the laboratory, a rare event is a rare event, and thus it has the implication that rare events have on our understood physics. In astronomy, processes that take shorter time will appear as outliers in our samples. So think, for example, in the context of a galaxy survey, and imagine that every galaxy in the universe turns pink to 5 minutes. Becomes pink, after 5 minutes, it stops being pink and comes back to its regular color. So this pink process is important and happens to every galaxy in the universe, but because it lasts only for 5 minutes out of the entire lifespan of a galaxy, if I look at a large survey that surveys galaxies, my probability of catching galaxies in their peak stage will be very, very low. So this can be a very common process, but it can still look as an outlier because of the timescales, different timescales that we're seeing for the evolution of our sources. Thank you. Okay. How can we detect outliers? If we've convinced ourselves that we have a good way of measuring similarities or distances between the objects, we can compute this pairwise similarity or distance and sort of identify the objects that are most distant on average from all the rest. From my experience, this type of technique identifies the outliers that shout the loudest. So it will identify a quasar in a sample of stars, for example, but it will not identify a star with weird absorption equivalent width ratios, for example. We can also use supervised learning. So in many algorithms that do classification, there are assigned probabilities of being assigned to a certain class in the context of supervised learning. And so we can consider outliers as objects that have low probability of being assigned to any class. We can use different unsupervised learning algorithms. So there are some clustering algorithms that mark outliers. We can also apply dimensionality reduction and identify outliers in this lower dimensional embedding. This as well, so it really depends on how we treat the data and what exactly are the type of features that we extract when we move to the low dimensional embedding. But what I saw is that, so for example, if you do have very well-defined clusters in your low dimensional embedding, you can find outliers just on the tails, which are both interesting and not very different from the rest of the population. And in addition to that, there are dedicated outlier detection algorithms that have different optimization objectives. I particularly like isolation forest. I worked with that quite a lot. Unfortunately, I don't have time to go through these different algorithms and what they do. I will give you I will give you slides that describe how isolation forest and local outlier factor work, in case that you're interested in playing around with them. Okay, so we have, I think, something like 2 or 3 slides to the end. I told you I'm going to be on time. Okay. This is perhaps one of the most important things that we should ask ourselves, how to interpret the output of unsupervised learning algorithms. So it really depends on whether we're working with derived features or with the raw data. But often what happens is that we apply these algorithms on our raw data, and then we get an output, like a list of classes or some reduced dimension, and then we're asking, okay, what's going on here? Is it real? Is it not real? Is it a Nature paper, or is it like something completely random that it picked up in the part of my image that I don't care about? And then all the like challenge and interesting work starts. And so I told you at the beginning of the lecture that in my eyes, we can't escape measuring physical features, even if we're working with the raw data. And we need these features in order to be able to interpret what it is that we're getting out. And so when we do have these physical features, we can color code the output of the dimensionality reduction algorithm by these derived features to understand what is the reduced dimension driven by. We can some of the algorithms actually have random seeds, so repeating the same run over and over is a good way of sort of seeing whether the results are stable. And if we have some sort of, metadata, so for example, classes of objects that we can color code by, that's another way of seeing whether what we're finding is real or not. In clustering, we can validate against known labels if we have them. When we have prototypes of some sort, we can inspect them and compare them to the objects in the cluster to see whether things make sense. We can check for correlation of the clusters with different derived properties. And in our detection, what I found is that checking how different outliers drop and come in for different methods is quite helpful in understanding which outliers are stable. But I really didn't find a good way than actually examining manually the outliers and sort of figuring out what went wrong in the reduction pipeline or the observation that caused the type of outlier that you're seeing. It's a lot of manual work, but I think that this is the science work. I think that's at least I find it very enjoyable. But yes, we do need, here we're applying our physical knowledge, and we need to understand our systems very well in order to be able to take these outputs of this unsupervised learning and actually learn something interesting from them. And so I'm getting back to the good practices I showed you at the beginning. And so to understand how these algorithms work and what the hyperparameters are doing, my suggestion to you is to start with the simulated data set that either has a sequence or has clusters in it, It doesn't have noise, it have very few number of features, and see what happens when you just play with the algorithm and change the hyperparameters. And only then gradually complicate the model, add noises, add clusters, add features, informative features, non-informative features, and see what happens then. Then I would suggest to go to a physically motivated model. So if, for example, you're studying spectra, so simulate, a spectrum with emission lines, or use different synthesis codes to simulate, for example, spectra of H2 regions, spectra of molecular clouds, and sort of put them into the algorithm and see what happens. And like my suggestion is to try and break the algorithm. Basically see how much you need to push it to make it stop working, to make you reach a wrong conclusion. Because usually what will happen is that you will apply it to the data, and your main worry is whether the output is misleading you to reach the wrong conclusion. This is something you want to be able to identify well before you're moving to your actual data to work with. The final slide is about the hands-on application. So you're going to have to choose what type of application you want to do. I am going to provide a number of Jupyter notebooks that explore different concepts that we touched upon in this lecture, both input data, different dimensionality reduction algorithms, different clustering algorithms, and how outliers and noise affect all sorts of properties. And there are slides that describe in detail some of the algorithms that here I had to run through, like go into the math of like PCA and non-negative matrix factorization, for example. And so if you're choosing to do that, no external data is necessary. We'll simulate everything using the Jupyter notebooks themselves. But you're, of course, welcome to use this code and apply to your data if you want. The second option, which I call the advanced option, and this is, I think, I would suggest to those of you who feel comfortable coding with Python, and it's not your first time sort of seeing Python environment and Jupyter notebooks, etc., is actually a hands-on exercise of interacting with one of the frontier AI models, ChatGPT, Gemini, Claude, etc., like your favorite one. Just for a raise of hand, how many of you have interacted with the frontier AI model up until now? Interesting. I would say 60%, I think. Okay. And so here, the idea would be to collaborate or to use this tool to identify the algorithm. You will choose a family of algorithms you want to work with. For example, I want to do dimensionality reduction. You will interact with the LLM to identify which dimensionality reduction you want to use. And then you will interact with an LLM to understand what are the hyperparameters, what is the cost function, what does it optimize, what do I need to be worried about, how to prepare my data, and then you'll ask the LLM to write you a code to do it and iterate until things look good. I've LLM work, how they're trained, what they know how to do, and where there are known failure modes. And they give you examples of what at least I found to be an effective way of interacting with them without making too many errors, because these are, again, text generators and they make mistakes, and we need to sort of train ourselves in understanding how to work with these very powerful yet sometimes wrong models. And so I will share with you the document, and then I will provide you a multi-wavelength data set from FANGs, both raw data like real images and spectra and derived features. And you can take the data and basically go with the LLM and try to build your own unsupervised learning application with it. You can also decide to copy code from the Jupyter notebooks I give that like actually use the code to do the different unsupervised learning tasks and apply them to the FANGs data if you want. But I do believe that nowadays learning how to interact with these frontier AI models becomes a more and more relevant skill for us to have. So if you feel that you can do it, I would encourage you to consider using this opportunity to do it. That's it. Thank you very much.
So Dalia told me that you would finish with 10 minutes of advance, and it's 10 to 6. So right on time, we have 10 minutes for questions.
Yes.
Well, thank you for this very nice overview. I was thinking since this morning, actually, that one thing that happens when people apply these neural networks to simulation data is that the first thing that the algorithm learns is which code did the simulation, so which simulation it is in. So I was wondering if there have been attempts to get rid of that vector in the reconstruction of the data. I think that I would be very interested to see how that looks like.
Yes, that's an excellent question. And I think there is, you can tie a connection to observation. So for example, you can, sorry, you can imagine a case in observation where these very complicated networks will learn the instrument and the telescope through which these were obtained. And yes, this is definitely a concern, and it's something that is very difficult to control if you're running the most complicated and advanced tools as is. There are different ways to sort of simulate data and add noise, but then again, making them actually work later on like actually data from simulations or from observations is its own challenge, essentially. But that's what happens when you allow for millions or billions of free parameters. And this is these big networks, this is what they're doing, right? So as you increase the number of free parameters, you are learning more and more complicated things about your data. And some of them are things that you as the astronomer or astrophysicist is not interested in. So one example of how to address it is consider using simpler methods that do not have so many free parameters, for example. Another method is to diversify the training set in a way that will allow them, for example, to not be sensitive to the simulation from which they came from or the telescope from which these images were observed. Another, I've seen a number of papers coming out, especially in the context of these vision transformers. These new, like transformers are these architectures that have been the driving force behind the large language model revolution that we're seeing. And there are transformers that are applied on imaging data and video data. And there are some works that are attempting to essentially disentangle impacts of the instrument or simulation from impacts of the physics. There are certain tricks that people have been exploring and starting to do. I'm pretty sure that this paper is public. I'm trying to remind myself where I saw it, but I can find it to you and send it to you if it's public and it's okay for me to send. And I am happy to also share it with everyone here on Slack. But people started to think about how in these complex embedding spaces, how we can sort of break different impacts. Like I specifically read about like instruments, different instruments, and how you disentangle the impact of the instrument from the impact of the actual observations. But I do think you can make a sort of like one-to-one comparison with simulations as well, and which simulation has been used for that. I don't know if Adeline has something else to say about that. I'm sure that you have many thoughts on the subject as well.
Maybe I can just add another view angle. There's been also a lot of research on changing domains. Domain is either the instrument you use or the imaging conditions and measurement conditions, things like this. And there's a whole literature on domain adaptation and transfer learning.
Yes.
So there's a lot to do on that side as well.
Yes, that's true. The entire world of domain adaptation attempts to address this type of problem. I don't know. I mean, we can talk about it offline, how much of this has actually been put to an actual test in terms of production, classification of galaxy morphologies and things like this, versus like, retraining everything from scratch once data arrives. But I'm happy to tie the loop and understand. Yes, yes, because like I see a lot of domain adaptation papers that show a proof of concept, but then how you actually put it into production mode, this I don't remember seeing too much. But if there are references that we can send for everyone, I think it can be very helpful for students here.
Are there any other questions?
Thank you very much. I have a question about the self-organizing map,
Mhm.
because I feel like it's kind of like similarity to the Bayesian like weighted calculation, like because I'm doing like SED fitting code Seagull, and the basic idea is once we have input observation data, we can generate a series of like simulated spectrum templates, and according to their like which their like properties are already known, and then according to their goodness of fitting to the observation data, we can like calculate weight for each of these templates, and then we did like a Bayesian like analyzation, so we derived the properties. So I wonder if this self-organizing maps could be a better way to do the same thing, like we use the simulated data to build this like 2D grids, so we can directly see the location of our observation data on the grid, so we can directly get the properties or something.
Yes, that's an excellent question, and I see the similarities that you're seeing between the two. I think that the main difference is when you're using Seagull, you're assuming the physics, and so you can essentially generate everything that you expect to see in the spectral domain of galaxies. Whereas here, what this method gives you is this representation if you don't have it. So when you're starting with, when you're initializing this sort of structure, the nodes are actually initialized to either random numbers or again, some PCA initialization. And then you sort of learn them as you feed new objects into the data. And so in your case, you're starting with a physical model where you have a number of parameters that sort of describe all the variation that you're going to see. It could be the case that you have actual observed objects that will not be well fitted by any of the Seagull models because the models are not general enough to produce these. But it might be the case that in the SOM, you will have a node that will describe such objects. But it's essentially a data-driven way to build this type of grid of what there is in my data set. Yes, but I can see the similarities very clearly between the two.
We have time for one more binary question, yes or no question. Is there one? No, if not, we can think again speak. Oh yeah, there's one, sorry.
Sorry, just a bit of a naive question. You mentioned earlier before the break that if you have like a huge spectrum, for example, and you have emission line that's occupying only a small fraction of the spectrum, then the distance will be dominated by the noise, basically. But what if you want to extract multiple features at the same time? For example, if you have a continuum, you want to classify basically try to figure out what kind of feature the continuum has, and also you have a spectral line mixed in there. How would you like kind of weigh these two different features? Because I guess the spectral line will be very like the space on the spectrum will be quite limited compared to the continuum.
Yes, yes, that's an excellent question. So the question is essentially like if I have a data set where I care both about the continuum and about features that may occupy a very small number of features in my feature space, how can I encode both of them? And so again, I'm coming from, and you hear it over and over again, like my first suggestion is that if you know what you care about, define it. Measure features and apply dimensionality reduction to these measured features. Don't let the algorithm figure out what you find important about the data. If you believe that the continuum is important and the shape of the continuum is important, define, measure it, and use that as a feature. If you believe that the emission line is important, measure the flux of the emission line and put it as a feature in your algorithm. And basically this way, build the feature set with which you're going to work. That would be my first suggestion. If you still want to work with raw data because you believe there might be something that you're missing and are not representing well in your derived features, there are various ways in which you can account for the correlations that you're seeing in your data. So for example, all the continuum pixels that sort of change together. So for example, applying PCA decomposition will help with later type of dimensionality reduction you would like to do. You can measure correlation matrices, or there are additional algorithms that can sort of weigh things according to the correlations between the different features. And you can use this weighting to define the distance matrix on which you're going to apply clustering or dimensionality reduction algorithm. But yeah, my suggestion, if you can, keep it in derived features.
Okay, so you mean you prep the data first before you apply?
Yes.
Okay.
Yes, yes. Again, I think it's a question of what's your goal, right? If your goal is to find something new in your data set or understand what's going on, and you already have made it to a point where you understand the physics that drives the emission and absorption that you're seeing in your sources, my suggestion would be to, yes, first define what it is that you're interested in and derive features.
Yeah, thanks.
So let's thank Dalya for the very good presentation. Thank you very much.